The bloodhounds returned alone, their muzzles stained crimson, tails tucked between trembling legs. Behind them, the Appalachian wilderness stretched silent as a grave. This is the story of how 7 armed slave catchers vanished without a trace in the mountains of Western Virginia, leaving behind only questions that echo through 2 centuries of American history. On the morning of September 14th, 1821, Captain Jeremiah Hawkins led his band of professional slave hunters into the Blue Ridge Mountains near present-day Shenandoah National Park. They carried rifles, rope, and iron shackles, tracking 3 escaped bondsmen who'd fled a tobacco plantation outside Richmond. The mountains smelled of pine pitch and autumn decay, their slopes carpeted with leaves that crackled underfoot like old parchment. Fog clung to the hollows between ridges, thick enough to muffle sound and swallow men whole. Before we climb deeper into these haunted hills, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records and family legends for over 200 years. Hawkins and his crew were no amateurs. They'd built their reputation hunting human quarry across the Carolinas and Virginia, returning runaway slaves to bondage with ruthless efficiency. The captain himself stood 6 feet tall, scarred from knife fights and broken bottles, carrying a custom rifle he'd named Retriever. His men included his brother Caleb, a former overseer named Dutch Morrison, and 4 other hardened trackers who knew how to read broken twigs and bent grass like scripture. The fugitives they pursued had names. Moses, a field hand in his 30s who'd learned to read despite Virginia law. Rachel, a house servant barely 20 who'd been sold away from her infant daughter. And Thomas, a blacksmith whose knowledge of metalwork made him valuable enough to risk everything for freedom. They disappeared from the Waverly plantation on September 10th, taking nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever hope they could carry. From the Hawkins family papers deposited at the Virginia Historical Society, September 14th, 1821, tracks lead north into the high country. Weather turning cold. Expect capture within 3 days. J. Hawkins. The slave catchers followed a clear trail for the first 2 days, finding cold campfires and torn fabric on thorns. Local settlers reported seeing the fugitives near Luray, heading toward the limestone caves that honeycomb the region. Hawkins pushed his men hard, knowing that escaped slaves who reached the underground networks in Pennsylvania rarely returned to bondage. But something changed on the morning of September 16th. The trail simply vanished. Not gradually, not scattered by rain or wind, but cut off as cleanly as if the 3 runaways had sprouted wings and taken flight. The tracking dogs whined and circled, confused by scents that led nowhere. Even stranger, the mountain itself seemed to reject the hunter's presence. Compasses spun wildly. Horses refused to climb certain ridges. The fog grew thicker despite clear skies above the tree line. Dutch Morrison later told his wife he felt like they were being watched from the moment they entered what locals called the hollow places. Eyes in the darkness between trees, shadows that moved against the wind. But Morrison was a practical man who trusted his rifle more than mountain superstition. He should have trusted the mountain instead. What the slave catchers didn't know was that these hills held secrets older than their republic, darker than their trade in human flesh. The Cherokee had stories about certain valleys where the dead walked and the living disappeared. Early settlers whispered about places where time bent strange and familiar paths led nowhere. Would you have pressed deeper into mountains that seemed to breathe with malevolent life? Or would you have turned back when the very earth beneath your feet felt wrong? The last confirmed sighting of Hawkins and his men came from a trapper named Isaiah Blackwood, who encountered them near sunset on September 16th. They were camped in a clearing beside a stream that ran red with iron deposits, their faces drawn with exhaustion and something approaching fear. Hawkins asked Blackwood about caves in the area, places where desperate people might hide. But when Blackwood returned to the same clearing 3 days later, searching for the men who'd failed to emerge from the mountains, he found something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The bloodhounds returned alone, their muzzles stained crimson, tails tucked between trembling legs. Behind them, the Appalachian wilderness stretched silent as a grave. This is the story of how 7 armed slave catchers vanished without a trace in the mountains of Western Virginia, leaving behind only questions that echo through 2 centuries of American history. On the morning of September 14th, 1821, Captain Jeremiah Hawkins led his band of professional slave hunters into the Blue Ridge Mountains near present-day Shenandoah National Park. They carried rifles, rope, and iron shackles, tracking 3 escaped bondsmen who'd fled a tobacco plantation outside Richmond. The mountains smelled of pine pitch and autumn decay, their slopes carpeted with leaves that crackled underfoot like old parchment. Fog clung to the hollows between ridges, thick enough to muffle sound and swallow men whole. Before we climb deeper into these haunted hills, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records and family legends for over 200 years. Hawkins and his crew were no amateurs. They'd built their reputation hunting human quarry across the Carolinas and Virginia, returning runaway slaves to bondage with ruthless efficiency. The captain himself stood 6 feet tall, scarred from knife fights and broken bottles, carrying a custom rifle he'd named Retriever. His men included his brother Caleb, a former overseer named Dutch Morrison, and 4 other hardened trackers who knew how to read broken twigs and bent grass like scripture. The fugitives they pursued had names. Moses, a field hand in his 30s who'd learned to read despite Virginia law. Rachel, a house servant barely 20 who'd been sold away from her infant daughter. And Thomas, a blacksmith whose knowledge of metalwork made him valuable enough to risk everything for freedom. They disappeared from the Waverly plantation on September 10th, taking nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever hope they could carry. From the Hawkins family papers, deposited at the Virginia Historical Society, September 14th, 1821, tracks lead north into the high country. Weather turning cold. Expect capture within 3 days. J. Hawkins. The slave catchers followed a clear trail for the first 2 days, finding cold campfires and torn fabric on thorns. Local settlers reported seeing the fugitives near Luray, heading toward the limestone caves that honeycomb the region. Hawkins pushed his men hard, knowing that escaped slaves who reached the underground networks in Pennsylvania rarely returned to bondage. But something changed on the morning of September 16th. The trail simply vanished. Not gradually, not scattered by rain or wind, but cut off as cleanly as if the 3 runaways had sprouted wings and taken flight. The tracking dogs whined and circled, confused by scents that led nowhere. Even stranger, the mountain itself seemed to reject the hunter's presence. Compasses spun wildly. Horses refused to climb certain ridges. The fog grew thicker despite clear skies above the tree line. Dutch Morrison later told his wife he felt like they were being watched from the moment they entered what locals called the hollow places. Eyes in the darkness between trees, shadows that moved against the wind. But Morrison was a practical man, who trusted his rifle more than mountain superstition. He should have trusted the mountain instead. What the slave catchers didn't know was that these hills held secrets older than their republic, darker than their trade in human flesh. The Cherokee had stories about certain valleys where the dead walked and the living disappeared. Early settlers whispered about places where time bent strange and familiar paths led nowhere. Would you have pressed deeper into mountains that seemed to breathe with malevolent life? Or would you have turned back when the very earth beneath your feet felt wrong? The last confirmed sighting of Hawkins and his men came from a trapper named Isaiah Blackwood, who encountered them near sunset on September 16th. They were camped in a clearing beside a stream that ran red with iron deposits, their faces drawn with exhaustion and something approaching fear. Hawkins asked Blackwood about caves in the area, places where desperate people might hide. But when Blackwood returned to the same clearing 3 days later, searching for the men who'd failed to emerge from the mountains, he found something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Ezekiel's massive hands trembled as he unwrapped a bundle of iron shackles, each link bearing tool marks that told a story no white lawman wanted to hear. The metal gleamed dull in Sheriff Randolph's office lamplight, speaking of midnight rescues and broken chains. This revelation would expose an underground network that had operated in Virginia's mountains for decades, turning supposed wilderness into a fortress of freedom. The blacksmith's shop in Warrenton smelled of coal smoke and hot metal, its walls lined with horseshoes and farming implements that provided perfect cover for more dangerous work. Ezekiel had purchased his freedom 15 years earlier, using skills learned in bondage to build a legitimate business that attracted customers from across Fauquier County. But respectability was only his daytime trade. "Sheriff," Ezekiel said, his voice careful as a man walking on river ice, "those slave catchers weren't the first to disappear in them hills. Been happening for near 20 years now, ever since the war ended and desperate folks started running north." Randolph studied the broken shackles on his desk, noting the precise cuts that had severed iron links without damaging the metal's integrity. No file or saw had made these breaks. The work required specialized tools and knowledge that few possessed outside military arsenals or advanced blacksmith shops. "You're saying someone's been killing slave hunters?" Randolph asked. "Not killing," Ezekiel replied. "Something else. Something the mountains do to men who hunt other men for money." The blacksmith's revelation unfolded like pages in a forbidden book. For 2 decades, professional slave catchers had vanished in the Blue Ridge Mountains with disturbing regularity. Not the occasional accident or bear attack that claimed all mountain travelers, but systematic disappearances that followed a pattern locals had learned to recognize. From Ezekiel Freeman's testimony, recorded September 24, 1821. "They come with dogs and chains, thinking the mountains are empty of everything but trees. Don't know the hills have been watching since before white men drew their first boundaries on stolen land." The network Ezekiel described stretched from the Shenandoah Valley to the Potomac River, connecting caves and hidden settlements where escaped slaves found sanctuary before continuing north. Cherokee guides who'd remained in Virginia despite government removal efforts. Free blacks like Ezekiel, who provided supplies and intelligence. Even white abolitionists who risked their property and lives to shelter runaways. But the mountains themselves played the largest role in this underground resistance. The limestone caverns that honeycombed the Blue Ridge created a natural fortress where fugitives could disappear for months. Underground streams provided fresh water. Hidden valleys offered fertile ground for subsistence farming. Most importantly, the terrain's complexity made tracking nearly impossible for outsiders unfamiliar with its secrets. The Cherokee call certain places the walking grounds, Ezekiel explained, where spirits of the dead don't rest peaceful. White folks who built their wealth on suffering find themselves walking those same paths, over and over, until the mountains claim what's owed. Randolph felt his Christian certainty wavering as Ezekiel spoke. The sheriff had grown up hearing similar stories from his grandmother, tales of mountains that moved when men weren't watching, and hollows where time flowed backward. He'd dismissed such nonsense as superstition until 7 armed men vanished without leaving so much as a broken twig behind. The dead don't negotiate. The blacksmith produced a leather satchel containing detailed maps hand-drawn on deerskin, showing cave systems and hidden trails that never appeared on official surveys. The cartography revealed a parallel geography existing beneath Virginia's documented landscape, a shadow world where different laws governed survival and justice. Moses, Rachel, and Thomas, Ezekiel said, naming the escaped slaves Hawkins had pursued. They knew about the network, knew which valleys to avoid and which caves would shelter them. But Captain Hawkins, he pressed deeper than most hunters dare, followed them into places where the mountain decides who lives and who walks forever. According to Ezekiel's network, the 3 fugitives had reached safety in a hidden settlement near present-day Skyline Drive. They'd been guided by a Cherokee woman, known only as the Pathwalker, who could navigate the mountains blindfolded and spoke languages older than English. The settlement housed 37 escaped slaves at the time, living in cave dwellings and cultivated clearings invisible from above. Hawkins and his men had unknowingly entered this sanctuary on September 16th, tracking their quarry straight into the heart of organized resistance. But what happened next defied conventional explanation. The Pathwalker told them hunters, Ezekiel continued, that the mountains would judge their hearts. 7 men who made their living chasing freedom. The land itself would decide their fate. Randolph pressed for details, but Ezekiel claimed ignorance of specific events. He knew only that Hawkins's group had encountered something in those hills that broke their will before breaking their bodies. The professional hunters who terrorized runaway slaves across 3 states had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind equipment arranged like shrine offerings to an angry god. The sheriff found himself facing an impossible choice: pursue an investigation that might expose Virginia's entire underground railroad network, risking political scandal and economic disruption, or close the case quietly, accepting that some disappearances served a justice higher than human law. His decision would determine whether 20 years of mountain resistance continued operating in shadow, or whether Virginia's governor would send militia into the Blue Ridge to crush the sanctuary network with military force. But first, Randolph needed to understand what really happened to 7 armed men who'd vanished like smoke in the mountain darkness. And the only way to learn that truth meant climbing into the same hills that had swallowed them whole. What price would the mountains demand from those who served legal slavery versus those who chose illegal freedom? By October 1st, 1821, Sheriff Randolph had assembled a different kind of search party, one that included Ezekiel Freeman as a guide and carried no weapons beyond what mountain travel required. They would enter the Blue Ridge not as hunters, but as supplicants, seeking answers from a landscape that had proven it could judge the living with permanent finality. The Pathwalker emerged from morning mist, like a figure carved from the mountain itself, her Cherokee features weathered by decades of guiding desperate souls through landscapes that killed the unprepared. Behind her, the Blue Ridge stretched endless and hungry. This encounter would reveal that some mountains harbor secrets too dangerous for official records, where justice flows by older laws than any courthouse could enforce. The meeting occurred at dawn on October 3rd, 1821, beside a limestone outcrop locals call Devil's Backbone. The air tasted of wood smoke and coming frost, while beneath their feet, fallen leaves crackled like whispered warnings. Sheriff Randolph studied the woman Ezekiel had brought to guide them, noting how she moved with the fluid silence of someone who'd spent her life avoiding detection. She spoke no English, communicating through hand signs and expressions that needed no translation. When Randolph showed her the broken shackles from Hawkins's camp, her dark eyes narrowed with something between satisfaction and sorrow. She gestured toward the deeper mountains, then drew a finger across her throat in a motion that transcended language barriers. She says the hunters found what they were looking for, Ezekiel translated, just not the way they expected. The pathwalker led them up trails that appeared on no government survey, following deer paths and water runs that twisted through terrain designed to confuse outsiders. Ancient Cherokee markers carved into bark guided their ascent, symbols warning of sacred ground and forbidden valleys where spirits demanded tribute from the living. By midday, they'd climbed into country that felt fundamentally different from the Virginia lowlands. The trees grew larger here, their trunks scarred by lightning and age, creating cathedral spaces where sound carried strangely. Compasses spun without cause. Shadows fell in directions that defied the sun's position. Even experienced woodsmen in their party muttered about places that felt wrong, valleys where the air itself seemed thick with watching presence. From Sheriff Randolph's private journal, October 3rd, 1821. The Cherokee woman knows these hills like scripture. Every stone and stream speaks to her in languages older than our republic. Beginning to understand why Hawkins never returned. They found the first evidence 2 miles past the abandoned slave-catcher camp. Not physical traces, but something more disturbing. Trees stripped of bark in perfect spirals, as if massive hands had twisted the living wood until it screamed. The pathwalker examined these markings with clinical attention, reading stories written in damaged timber. She spoke rapidly to Ezekiel, who translated with visible reluctance. She says this is where the hunting party split up. Captain Hawkins sent his men in different directions, trying to surround the fugitives. That was their mistake. What mistake? Randolph asked. Dividing their strength in country that doesn't forgive weakness. The mountains here hunted back. The Cherokee guide led them to a series of limestone caves that honeycombed the ridge like hidden cities. These weren't simple bear dens or shelter caverns, but carefully modified spaces where human habitation stretched back generations. Smoke-blackened walls bore pictographs depicting hunts and harvests, warfare and ceremony. But newer additions caught Randolph's attention. Drawings that showed men with dogs chasing other men, followed by images of the earth opening to swallow the pursuers. Inside the largest cave, they discovered the underground settlement Ezekiel had described. 37 escaped slaves had lived here at the time of Hawkins's pursuit, creating a functional community in spaces carved from living rock. Sleeping chambers, common areas, even a workshop where broken tools received repair. The settlement showed signs of hasty abandonment, cold fire pits, scattered belongings, food stores left behind in desperate flight. But the residents hadn't fled from slave catchers. They'd fled from what happened to the slave catchers. Moses, Rachel, and Thomas were waiting in the deepest chamber, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. They'd hidden in these caves for 3 weeks, afraid to emerge after witnessing events that shattered their understanding of natural law. When they saw Randolph's badge, terror flooded their expressions, until Ezekiel assured them this search party came seeking truth, not fugitives. "Tell him what you saw," Ezekiel urged Moses in the careful English of a self-taught reader. Go tell him what the mountain did to them hunters. Moses spoke haltingly, his field-weathered hands shaking as memory transported him back to September 16th. The three fugitives had reached the cave settlement after 4 days of hard travel, guided by network contacts who knew every hidden trail. They'd felt safe for the first time since leaving the plantation, surrounded by others who'd chosen freedom over bondage. Then Captain Hawkins and his men arrived. They came at dusk, Moses whispered. Thought they had us trapped like rabbits in a burrow. Started calling for us to surrender, promising easy treatment if we came peaceful. But this mountain, it don't tolerate that kind of talk. What happened next would challenge every assumption Sheriff Randolph held about the natural world's limitations. The Cherokee woman listened to Moses's account with stone-faced attention, occasionally nodding as familiar patterns emerged. When the story ended, she spoke a single word that Ezekiel translated with visible unease. Judgment, he said. She calls it judgment. But before Randolph could process this revelation, the pathwalker gestured toward a tunnel that descended deeper into the mountain's heart, where limestone gave way to older stone and the air grew cold enough to see breath. Her meaning was clear. If they wanted to understand what happened to 7 armed slave catchers, they would have to follow the same path into darkness. Would you descend into caves where the mountain itself dispensed justice too terrible for human courts to contemplate? The sheriff stood at the threshold between documented law and something far older, knowing that whatever lay ahead would either explain the impossible or drive him mad with truths too large for official reports to contain. Deeper in the mountain's belly, Sheriff Randolph's lantern revealed 7 sets of clothes arranged in a perfect circle, each garment laid out as if its owner had simply evaporated from within. The fabric showed no tears, no blood, no signs of struggle, just empty shapes that held the memory of men. This discovery would force Randolph to confront the possibility that some justices operate beyond human comprehension, where mountains themselves serve as judge and executioner. The descent through limestone passages led steadily downward, following water-carved channels that predated European settlement by millennia. The air grew thick with mineral scents and something else, an earthiness that spoke of deep places where sunlight never penetrated. Cherokee pictographs covered the walls in increasingly complex patterns, telling stories that seemed to move in flickering lantern light. The pathwalker stopped at a circular chamber where 7 natural pillars supported a domed ceiling. Calcified flowstone had created formations that resembled courthouse columns, while mineral deposits on the floor formed patterns too regular for mere geological accident. This was clearly a place of ceremony, where generations had gathered for purposes that transcended everyday survival. The judgment ground, Ezekiel whispered, translating the Cherokee woman's gestures, where the mountain speaks to those who've lost their way. Randolph's lantern beam swept across the chamber, revealing the impossible arrangement. 7 complete sets of clothing lay in a precise circle around a central depression filled with spring water. Captain Hawkins's coat, Dutch Morrison's boots, every piece of gear that had identified the slave catchers as individuals, but no bodies, no bones, no trace of the men who'd worn these garments. The clothes themselves told a disturbing story. Each set was positioned exactly as if its owner had been standing upright when they simply ceased to exist. Boots remained laced, shirts held their shape, even small personal items stayed in jacket pockets. Whatever had happened here had been instantaneous and absolute. From the Cherokee oral tradition, as recorded by ethnographer James Mooney, the mountain remembers every drop of blood spilled upon its slopes. When hunters become the hunted, The earth itself rises to restore the balance torn by human cruelty. The pathwalker moved to the center of the circle, kneeling beside the spring where clear water bubbled up from depths unknown. She cupped the liquid in her hands, tasting it with the reverence of communion, then spoke a series of words that needed no translation. Randolph felt their weight in his bones, an invocation or prayer to powers that existed before his God walked among men. Moses stepped forward, his voice barely audible in the sacred space. She's calling to the ones who walked before us, the Cherokee who died fighting to keep these mountains free, the slaves who ran here and never made it north, all the blood this ground has tasted. The spring water reflected lantern light like a mirror, but the reflection showed more than their assembled faces. Images moved in the depths, scenes that played out like memories preserved in liquid amber. Randolph saw Cherokee warriors falling to disease and bullets, escaped slaves collapsing from exhaustion in hidden valleys, generations of suffering absorbed by limestone and soil. But he also saw the 7 slave catchers entering this chamber on September 16th, their faces hard with professional determination. They'd followed clear tracks to this underground sanctuary, expecting to find cowering fugitives ready for capture. Instead, they'd encountered something that judged their souls and found them wanting. The mountain remembers everything. The Cherokee woman began to chant in her ancestral language, her voice echoing off stone walls in harmonies that seemed to awaken the chamber itself. The air grew thick, pressing against their eardrums like deep water. Randolph's vision blurred, showing him events that had occurred 3 weeks earlier with vivid clarity. Captain Hawkins had entered this space first, rifle ready, calling for the fugitives to surrender. His voice had carried the authority of legal bounty hunting, backed by Virginia statutes that defined escaped slaves as property to be recovered. But the mountain recognized no human law that treated souls as commodities. The spring water had begun to glow with phosphorescent light, drawing the slave catchers forward despite their instincts. One by one, they'd approached the circle's edge, mesmerized by reflections that showed them visions of their own making. Every slave they'd captured, every family they'd destroyed, every child torn from its mother's arms for the crime of seeking freedom. Dutch Morrison had broken first, weeping as he saw himself through his victim's eyes. The others followed, their professional callousness cracking under the weight of accumulated cruelty. They'd built their lives on human suffering, and the mountain demanded an accounting that no earthly court could render. What the pathwalker showed them next would haunt Randolph's dreams for the remainder of his life. The 7 men hadn't died in any conventional sense. They'd simply been judged unworthy of continued existence, their life force drawn into the mountain itself as payment for decades of inflicted pain. Their clothes remained as evidence of passage, but their souls had become part of the stone and water that remembered every injustice. The mountain don't just hide runaways, Ezekiel said quietly. It protects them, and it settles debts that human law won't touch. The Cherokee woman concluded her ceremony by filling a small gourd with spring water, then pouring it over each set of empty clothes. Where the liquid touched fabric, the garments began to dissolve, returning to the earth that had claimed their owners. Within minutes, nothing remained but stains on stone that would fade with the next underground flood. Randolph understood that he was witnessing something beyond his authority to investigate or judge. The mountain had dispensed justice according to laws older than Virginia's statutes, weighing the souls of 7 men who'd made their living hunting other humans. The verdict had been final and irreversible. But as they prepared to leave the judgment chamber, the pathwalker gestured toward another passage that led even deeper into the mountain's heart. Her expression suggested that the 7 slave catchers were only the most recent addition to a collection that stretched back generations. How many other hunters had found their way to this place? How many other judgments had the mountain rendered in the name of justice too complex for human courts to understand? The sheriff would have to decide whether some truths were too dangerous for official records, or whether Virginia deserved to know that its mountains harbored powers that rendered human law irrelevant when weighed against older accountings. The deeper passage revealed bone-white formations that weren't limestone at all, but calcified remnants of countless others who'd entered these mountains seeking human prey. Each skeletal fragment told a story of hunters who'd become the hunted across decades of mountain justice. This macabre discovery would reveal the true scope of resistance that had operated in Virginia's wilderness for generations, claiming lives with the methodical patience of geological time. Sheriff Randolph followed the pathwalker through tunnels that narrowed and widened like breathing passages, their walls lined with mineral deposits that gleamed wet in lantern light. The air tasted of copper and ancient water, while beneath their feet, worn stones bore the polish of countless passages. This wasn't merely a cave system. It was a thoroughfare used by generations of Cherokee and escaped slaves who'd transformed natural caverns into an underground highway to freedom. The Cherokee woman stopped at an opening that revealed a vast chamber stretching beyond their light's reach. Natural shelves carved by water action lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each ledge holding artifacts that documented 2 centuries of mountain resistance. Broken chains from different eras, rifles bearing maker's marks from Richmond, Charleston, and Baltimore, personal effects that had belonged to slave catchers who'd vanished without official explanation. "Sweet Jesus," Ezekiel whispered, his voice echoing off stone walls. How many hunters came into these hills and never came out? The pathwalker moved methodically through the collection, pointing to specific items while speaking in Cherokee. Her gestures painted a timeline that stretched back to the Revolutionary War, when the first professional slave catchers had begun operating in Virginia's frontier regions. Each display represented men who'd made their living pursuing human quarry, only to find themselves judged by powers older than any legal system. Moses examined a corroded rifle bearing the inscription, "Property of H. Caldwell, Norfolk." The weapon's stock showed teeth marks where something had gnawed through seasoned hickory, leaving behind grooves too large for any known animal. Other firearms displayed similar damage: metal barrels twisted into impossible spirals, wooden components reduced to sawdust by forces that defied explanation. From the Journal of Confederate deserter James Whitfield, discovered 1863. The mountains eat slave hunters like candy. Been happening since before my grandfather's time. Smart folks know which valleys to avoid when the hunting season opens. The Cherokee woman led them to a section where stone shelves held more recent additions. Captain Hawkins's distinctive rifle occupied a place of honor among weapons that told similar stories. Dutch Morrison's compass, its needle frozen pointing toward magnetic north, that didn't exist in these depths. Personal items from the other 5 hunters, arranged with ritual precision that spoke of ceremony rather than random collection. But the most disturbing displays contained evidence of slave catchers who'd vanished years before Hawkins's expedition. The Bloodhound brothers, professional trackers who disappeared in 1815 while pursuing a family of 8 escaped slaves. The Richmond Company, 5 armed men who'd entered the Blue Ridge in 1808 and never returned to collect their substantial reward. Dozens of individual hunters whose fate had become local legend, whispered in taverns but never officially investigated. "The mountain keeps its own records," Ezekiel said, studying artifacts that documented decades of systematic disappearances. Every man who came here hunting souls found himself judged by older laws than Virginia ever wrote. The deeper they penetrated into this underground museum, the older the evidence became. Cherokee weapons mixed with colonial-era firearms, shackles bearing Spanish makers' marks alongside iron restraints forged in American foundries. The mountain had been dispensing its own justice since European settlers first began treating human beings as property to be recovered. The souls never stop walking. Randolph realized he was witnessing something that challenged every assumption about law and order in the American South. For generations, the mountains had served as more than hiding places for escaped slaves. They'd actively protected fugitives by eliminating their pursuers, using methods that transcended human understanding, but achieved results no court could match. The pathwalker gestured toward pictographs that covered the chamber's far wall, their images telling stories in visual language that needed no translation. Cherokee artists had documented the mountain's judgments across centuries, showing how the land itself rose against those who violated its sacred laws. The earliest drawings depicted Spanish conquistadors vanishing into limestone sinkholes. Later images showed colonial slave catchers being swallowed by fog that never lifted. But the most recent pictographs caught Randolph's attention. Fresh charcoal marks showed 7 figures entering the mountain, followed by images of empty clothes arranged in ceremonial circles. The Cherokee had been documenting Hawkins's fate even as it unfolded, recording another chapter in a story that stretched back to their ancestors' first encounters with European brutality. "How long has this been happening?" Randolph asked. The Cherokee woman spoke briefly, her words translated by Ezekiel with visible reluctance. "Since the first man decided he owned another man's soul. The mountain remembers the original sin, and it collects payment when human law fails." As they prepared to leave this gallery of lost hunters, Randolph understood that he faced an impossible choice. The evidence before him documented systematic disappearances that spanned generations, revealing a pattern of mountain justice that operated outside legal framework. But exposing this truth would destroy the underground network that had saved hundreds of lives while covering it up meant accepting that some justice transcended human authority. The Cherokee woman led them toward passages that would return them to daylight, but her expression suggested their underground journey had revealed only a fraction of the mountain's secrets. Somewhere in the deeper tunnels lay evidence of judgments that stretched back to the beginning of human cruelty, where the earth itself had chosen sides in conflicts that official history preferred to forget. What would Sheriff Randolph tell Virginia's governor about 7 missing slave catchers? And how would he explain evidence that the mountains themselves had been waging war against slavery since before the Republic's founding? The answer would determine whether generations of mountain resistance continued protecting the desperate, or whether Virginia's militia would march into the Blue Ridge to destroy a sanctuary that had dispensed its own terrible justice for 200 years. Sheriff Randolph emerged from the mountain caves carrying secrets that could topple Virginia's entire social order. His official report balanced on the knife's edge between truth and treason. In his saddlebags rode evidence that the Blue Ridge had been dispensing its own justice for generations. This moment would determine whether 2 centuries of mountain resistance continued protecting the desperate, or whether Virginia's governor would send militia to destroy a sanctuary older than the Republic itself. The ride back to Front Royal stretched through October wilderness, painted in scarlet and gold, autumn's beauty masking the weight of impossible decisions. Randolph's horse picked its way down mountain trails, while the sheriff's mind wrestled with revelations that challenged everything he'd believed about law, justice, and the natural order. The pathwalker had vanished at dawn like morning mist, leaving no trace except Cherokee symbols carved into bark. Warnings or blessings, he couldn't tell which. Ezekiel rode beside him in thoughtful silence, understanding that the next few hours would determine the fate of hundreds of escaped slaves who'd found sanctuary in Virginia's hidden valleys. Behind them, Moses, Rachel, and Thomas followed on borrowed mounts, their freedom hanging on whatever story the sheriff chose to tell his superiors in Richmond. The justice of mountains versus the justice of men, which would prevail when they reached civilization's edge. By evening, they'd descended into settled country, where smoke rose from cabin chimneys and lamplight glowed in courthouse windows. The familiar sights of ordered society felt alien after witnessing chambers where older laws held sway. Randolph's badge carried the authority of Virginia statutes, but the mountains had shown him justice that operated beyond human legislation. In his office that night, surrounded by law books and official forms, Randolph faced the most consequential decision of his career. The blank incident report waited on his desk like a confession booth, demanding truth that could destroy lives or lies that enabled continued suffering. His pen trembled as he considered what words could contain the reality he'd witnessed. From Sheriff Thomas Randolph's official report, filed October 8, 1821. After extensive search of the Blue Ridge region, no trace of Captain Jeremiah Hawkins or his associates has been discovered. Presumed lost to natural hazards common in mountain terrain, investigation closed pending new evidence. 23 words that buried 2 centuries of mountain resistance beneath bureaucratic language. Randolph had chosen silence over revelation, protecting a network that saved lives at the cost of his own oath to report criminal activity. But was harboring escaped slaves truly criminal when the law itself enabled greater crimes against human dignity? The 3 fugitives, Moses, Rachel, and Thomas, received new identities through Ezekiel's network, continuing north toward communities where freedom meant more than legal status. They carried with them memories of mountains that judged souls rather than skin color, places where justice flowed according to natural law older than any human constitution. But Randolph's decision created ripple effects that spread far beyond his jurisdiction. When Governor James Pleasants received reports of missing slave catchers, he ordered increased patrols along mountain borders. Professional hunters demanded military escorts for future expeditions into the Blue Ridge. Plantation owners pressured Richmond legislators to classify mountain resistance as insurrection requiring armed response. The pressure mounted through the winter of 1821 as more hunting parties reported strange incidents in the high country. Compasses spinning wildly, dogs refusing to follow certain trails, experienced trackers becoming lost in terrain they'd navigated for years. The mountains themselves seemed to resist intrusion by those who served the slave system. Yet no additional hunters vanished completely until spring brought fresh attempts to penetrate the sanctuary network. A 6-man expedition from North Carolina disappeared near Grandfather Mountain in March 1822. The Appalachian Company, 12 professional slave catchers, vanished without trace in Tennessee's Smoky Mountains that same summer. Each incident followed the pattern Randolph had documented: complete disappearance of personnel while equipment remained undisturbed. The mountains were choosing sides. By 1823, insurance companies refused to cover slave hunting expeditions into Appalachian territory. Professional trackers demanded hazard pay that exceeded potential bounties. Some hunters simply refused mountain assignments, claiming the risks outweighed any possible reward. The underground network had achieved through supernatural terror what legal abolition couldn't accomplish: functional protection for escaped slaves seeking freedom. But Sheriff Randolph paid a personal price for his silence. Nightmares plagued his sleep, visions of empty clothes arranged in ceremonial circles, while Cherokee voices chanted judgments in languages he couldn't understand. He aged rapidly, his hair turning white within 2 years of his mountain experience. Colleagues noticed his reluctance to discuss the Hawkins case, his tendency to steer conversations away from topics involving escaped slaves or mountain disappearances. In 1825, Randolph received an unsigned letter containing a single pressed magnolia blossom, impossible flora for Virginia's climate. The message was clear. The mountains remembered those who'd chosen correctly when faced with moral crossroads. His silence had protected hundreds of lives, earning gratitude from powers that operated beyond human recognition or reward. The Cherokee woman had told him through Ezekiel that the mountains would always remember friends and enemies alike. Those who served justice found protection in the wilderness. Those who enabled cruelty discovered that natural law eventually claimed its due, regardless of human statutes that protected profitable evil. As Randolph contemplated retirement in 1828, he understood that his choice to bury the truth had preserved something more valuable than career advancement or legal consistency. The Blue Ridge continued sheltering desperate souls, its caverns and hidden valleys serving as stations on an underground railroad that operated beyond government reach or control. But on quiet nights, when wind howled through mountain passes, residents of Front Royal still reported hearing sounds that defied explanation. Voices calling in Cherokee and English, the echo of iron chains breaking, footsteps that followed no earthly trails. The mountains remembered everything, including 7 slave catchers who'd learned that some justice transcends human law. What happens when the earth itself chooses between legal slavery and illegal freedom? How many other hunters would find their way to judgment chambers, where older powers weighed souls against centuries of accumulated cruelty? The answers lay buried in limestone caverns, where Cherokee pictographs continued documenting mountain justice, adding new chapters to stories that began when the first human decided to own another's soul. And somewhere in those depths, 7 sets of empty clothes served as warning to future hunters that the Blue Ridge dispensed its own terrible mercy to those who trafficked in human misery. Modern hikers on the Appalachian Trail report finding campsites abandoned mid-meal, boots still warm around cold fire pits, as if their occupants simply walked into the mountain mist and never returned. The pattern Sheriff Randolph documented in 1821 continues to this day. This legacy reveals that some justices operate outside human timelines, where mountains remember every drop of spilled blood and dispense verdicts across generations of accumulated guilt. The Blue Ridge Parkway now cuts through valleys where Cherokee guides once led escaped slaves to freedom, its asphalt ribbon connecting scenic overlooks that hide limestone caverns filled with 2 centuries of mountain justice. Rangers at Shenandoah National Park maintain official silence about the disappearances that occur with disturbing regularity. Day hikers who vanish between marked trails, camping parties found empty with gear arranged in inexplicable patterns. But locals remember what government reports prefer to forget. In mountain communities that stretch from Virginia to Tennessee, older residents still whisper about valleys where compasses spin wildly and cell phones lose signal. Places where the Cherokee say spirits walk, seeking balance for crimes that human courts never addressed. The descendants of Sheriff Randolph's decision continue operating in modern form. Underground networks that once moved escaped slaves now shelter undocumented immigrants, domestic violence survivors, and others fleeing various forms of bondage. The mountains still provide sanctuary for those whom legal systems fail to protect. their limestone caverns adapted for contemporary refugees seeking freedom. Dr. Jennifer Blackwood, a descendant of the trapper who first discovered Hawkins's abandoned camp, conducts unofficial research into Appalachian disappearances through her position at Virginia Tech. Her files contain incident reports spanning 2 centuries, documenting vanishings that follow patterns too consistent for coincidence. Professional bounty hunters, immigration enforcement officers, private investigators tracking fugitives, all sharing the common thread of hunting human beings for profit. From Dr. Blackwood's research notes, dated October 15, 2023. The statistical probability of this many disappearances occurring in specific geographic zones approaches 0. Yet official investigations consistently conclude lost to natural hazards, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Modern technology hasn't eliminated the mountain's selective appetite. GPS units malfunction in certain areas, leading search parties in circles until their batteries die. Drone footage from restricted zones shows clearings that appear empty from above, but contain infrared signatures suggesting recent habitation. Satellite imagery occasionally captures thermal anomalies in cave systems that suggest underground communities existing below government radar. The Cherokee Nation maintains cultural preservation sites throughout their ancestral territory, including areas where tribal elders conduct ceremonies that outsiders aren't permitted to witness. These gatherings often coincide with reported disappearances of individuals whose activities involve exploiting vulnerable populations. Park Service rangers have learned not to investigate too closely when tribal representatives request temporary access to sacred sites. The mountains still choose sides. Internet forums dedicated to missing persons cases contain threads documenting the Appalachian pattern, disappearances that cluster around specific coordinates where historical records show slave catcher activity. Conspiracy theorists propose everything from government black sites to alien abduction, missing the simpler truth that some landscapes exact justice according to laws older than human civilization. But the most compelling evidence comes from first-hand accounts shared in mountain communities, where Cherokee and European bloodlines intertwined across generations. Families whose ancestors guided the Underground Railroad still receive visits from strangers seeking passage to safety. The routes have changed, the threats have evolved, but the mountain sanctuaries continue operating according to principles Sheriff Randolph chose to protect rather than expose. Modern slave traffickers occasionally disappear while pursuing victims through Appalachian territory. Corporate executives who profit from prison labor vanish during hunting trips in the Blue Ridge. Immigration officials tracking family separations find themselves lost in terrain their equipment can't navigate. The mountain's appetite for those who commodify human suffering remains as sharp as limestone cutting through ancient stone. In 2022, a private military contractor named Marcus Healy disappeared while tracking a whistleblower through Virginia's George Washington National Forest. His equipment was found arranged in a perfect circle around a natural spring, clothes laid out as if their owner had evaporated mid-step. The incident report cited natural hazards, but local Cherokee representatives attended his memorial service, leaving tobacco offerings and speaking words in languages that predate English. The spring where Healy vanished runs red with iron deposits, just like the stream beside the clearing where Captain Hawkins made his final camp. The water tastes of copper and old blood, flowing from limestone caves that hold secrets too dangerous for official documentation. Park rangers rope off these areas when disappearances occur, citing ecological sensitivity while underground networks continue their ancient work. What drives the mountains to remember every injustice across centuries of accumulated cruelty? How many more hunters will follow the same paths into darkness before humanity learns that some justice transcends legal statute? The Cherokee woman known as the Pathwalker died in 1867, but her granddaughter trains guides who know which valleys shelter the desperate and which caves dispense judgment to those who exploit human desperation. The network adapts to contemporary threats while maintaining connections to powers that operate beyond government authority or understanding. Every autumn, when mountain mist rises from valleys where Cherokee ancestors walked and escaped slaves found freedom, hikers report hearing voices calling in languages they don't recognize. The sounds echo from limestone caverns where empty clothes serve as warnings to future hunters that the Blue Ridge remembers everything, forgives nothing, and continues dispensing its own terrible mercy to those who traffic in human misery. Today, park rangers still find abandoned campsites with meals half-eaten and boots arranged in ceremonial circles, as if their occupants heard something calling from the depths and chose to answer rather than flee. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.